On March 30th, 2002, more than 200,000 people filed past a coffin in Westminster Hall. They queued for hours, sometimes through the night, to pay respects to a woman who had died at 101 years old. The crowd stretched across London. Tributes flooded in from every corner of the Commonwealth. For millions of Britons, especially those old enough to remember the war, the Queen Mother was, quite simply, the best of Britain. And yet, scroll through any video about the crown, and you'll find a war happening in the comments. Two camps, completely opposed, absolutely certain the other side is wrong. Camp 1 says the Queen Mother was secretly awful, cold, controlling, a villain who ruined her daughter's life and pushed her grandson into a doomed marriage. Camp 2 says the crown assassinated a national hero, a woman who held Britain together during the Blitz, who refused to flee when bombs fell on her own palace, who everyone who ever met her adored. Here's the thing. They're both right, not in some wishy-washy, truth-is-in-the-middle way. They're both literally correct. Because the Queen Mother was two completely different people, and the fight in those comment sections isn't about who's lying. It's about which version of her each side actually met. So let's do this properly. A trial, evidence for both cases. You're the jury. But first, you need to understand where she came from, because the woman who would become both Britain's beloved grandmother and her own family's emotional iceberg started life with no expectation of royalty at all. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on August 4th, 1900, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, the 9th of 10 children. Her father was Claude Bowes-Lyon, Lord Glamis, nobility, not royalty. An important distinction. The Bowes-Lyons were wealthy, connected, aristocratic, but they weren't in line for any throne. Glamis Castle itself was a turreted Gothic pile steeped in legend. Shakespeare set Macbeth's murder of Duncan within its walls. Local whispers spoke of a monster hidden in a secret room, a deformed heir, supposedly bricked up alive generations earlier. Whether young Elizabeth believed these stories or not, she grew up surrounded by that peculiar blend of grandeur and darkness that characterized Scottish aristocratic life at the turn of the century. She met Prince Albert, Duke of York, in 1920. Bertie, as the family called him, was the second son of King George V, a stammering, nervous young man utterly overshadowed by his glamorous elder brother David, the Prince of Wales, and heir apparent. Bertie fell hard for Elizabeth. She wasn't interested. She reportedly turned down his marriage proposals twice. Why? Because she was reluctant to sacrifice the freedom of private life for the constraints of royalty. She knew what marrying into that family would mean: the public scrutiny, the loss of autonomy, the endless obligation. She said no, then no again. Then, in January 1923, she said yes. They married on April 26, 1923, at Westminster Abbey, making Elizabeth the first commoner to marry a son of the reigning monarch in over 300 years. The union was considered a love match, unusual for royal marriages of the era. The new Duchess of York charmed the public immediately. Pretty without being intimidating, friendly without being common, socially gifted in ways her awkward husband conspicuously lacked. For 13 years, she lived the comfortable life of a royal spare's wife. She gave birth to Princess Elizabeth in 1926 and Princess Margaret in 1930. The Duke and Duchess of York represented the crown at functions, toured the empire, and maintained the dignified obscurity appropriate to their position. Elizabeth had every reason to expect this pleasant existence to continue indefinitely. David would become king, marry some suitable princess, produce heirs. The York family would recede further into the royal background with each generation. Then, 1936 happened. King George V died in January 1936. David ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. Within months, his relationship with Wallis Simpson had precipitated the greatest constitutional crisis since the 17th century. Wallis was American. She was divorced, twice. Her second husband was still living. The king was determined to marry her, regardless of consequences. The British government, the Church of England, and the Dominion prime ministers were equally determined that a twice-divorced American could never be queen. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin spent weeks trying to find a solution. A morganatic marriage, perhaps, where Wallis would become the king's wife, but not his queen, and any children would be excluded from succession. The cabinet rejected it. The Church of England, which the monarch headed, could not bless a marriage to a divorced woman whose former husband still lived. The Dominion governments, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, made clear they would not accept Wallis as queen under any circumstances. Edward had three choices: give up Wallis, give up the throne, or attempt to force the marriage through against the advice of his ministers, triggering a constitutional crisis that could bring down the government. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII signed the Instrument of Abdication. He renounced the throne for himself and his descendants to marry the woman I love. Bertie became King George VI that same day. Elizabeth became Queen Consort, a position she had never sought, never wanted, and for which her husband was profoundly unprepared. Watch footage of George VI's early speeches. The stammer is painful, the nervous disposition obvious. He had no training for the throne because he was never supposed to sit on it. Elizabeth watched her husband struggle through public appearances, endure comparisons to his polished brother, age visibly under pressure he had never asked to bear. She blamed Edward and Wallis for everything, for stealing her family's privacy, for destroying her husband's health, for forcing a burden onto reluctant shoulders. This resentment never faded. For the rest of her century-long life, Elizabeth reportedly referred to Wallis Simpson as "that woman" and opposed any recognition or reconciliation, even decades after the abdication's political significance had faded. The experience crystallized something fundamental in her character, an absolute conviction that personal happiness must be sacrificed to duty, that anyone who chose love over obligation was not merely selfish, but treasonous. She had not chosen to become queen. She had accepted it because duty demanded acceptance. She had not wanted her nervous husband to wear the crown. She had supported him because the institution required support. This, in her worldview, was simply how responsible people behaved. The abdication proved what happened when royals prioritized their own desires. Catastrophe. Upheaval. Burdens thrust onto those who had done nothing to deserve them. Remember this lesson, because she applied it to everyone she loved for the next 65 years. The prosecution calls its first witness. Princess Margaret met Group Captain Peter Townsend in 1947. She was 16. Young, yes, but not foolish. Townsend was a decorated Royal Air Force pilot who served as equerry to her father. 15 years her senior, married with 2 children. On paper, entirely wrong for her. But feelings don't read paper, and Margaret's feelings deepened into something serious after King George VI died on February 6, 1952. She had adored her father with a fierce, uncomplicated love. Townsend had been a familiar presence during the darkest days of her life, the man who stood beside the king, who understood the private family behind the public institution. By November 1952, Townsend had divorced his wife Rosemary. By April 1953, he proposed to Margaret. She said yes. The constitutional problem was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required parliamentary approval for any marriage by a member of the royal family under 25. Margaret was 22. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's cabinet made clear that approval would never come. The echoes of the abdication crisis, less than 2 decades past, were still reverberating through every government office and palace corridor. The romance became public knowledge at Queen Elizabeth II's coronation on June 2, 1953. Journalists observed Margaret picking a piece of lint from Townsend's uniform with unmistakable intimacy, a small gesture, devastating in its implications. The scandal erupted immediately. The Church of England would not bless a princess marrying a divorced man. The establishment had learned its lesson from Edward VIII. They would not bend again. Townsend was posted to Brussels as heir attaché, exile disguised as a diplomatic assignment, a cooling-off period that everyone knew was designed to break them apart through sheer distance and time. So where was her mother in all this? Lord Charteris, private secretary to Queen Elizabeth II, reportedly observed that the Queen Mother was not a mother to her child during this period, not actively hostile, just absent, emotionally unavailable at the exact moment Margaret needed maternal support most desperately. Think about the Queen Mother's position. She had enormous influence within the royal family. She had public sympathy that politicians genuinely respected. The beloved wartime queen, the woman who had stayed in London during the Blitz, the national grandmother. If she had publicly supported Margaret's desire to marry Townsend, the political calculation might have shifted. Public sentiment follows beloved figures. Politicians follow public sentiment. Had the Queen Mother fought for her daughter's happiness, the outcome might have been different. She didn't fight. Her position was consistent with everything she believed since December 11, 1936. Duty supersedes personal desire. She had sacrificed her own preferences when the abdication thrust unwanted responsibility on her family. Margaret must do the same. The fact that Margaret would be sacrificing love rather than privacy seemed, to the Queen Mother, a distinction without meaningful difference. Sacrifice was sacrifice. Duty was duty. End of discussion. Margaret waited until her 25th birthday, August 21, 1955, when she could theoretically marry without parliamentary approval by renouncing her succession rights and royal income. This was her moment of genuine choice, the moment when she could have said, "I choose love over position, happiness over obligation, Peter over the institution." On October 31, 1955, she issued a statement. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." Read those words carefully. They sound like committee work, because they were. Margaret was parroting the establishment's values back at them, her mother's values, her sister's values, the Church's values, justifying a decision that had essentially been made for her by everyone except herself. She could have chosen differently. But everything in her upbringing, every lesson her mother had taught by example and expectation, told her that such a choice would be not merely costly, but wrong, selfish, treasonous. Like Uncle David and that woman, Margaret made the dutiful choice, the right choice, the choice her mother had made when accepting an unwanted crown, and then spent 47 years paying for it. She spiraled into destructive patterns almost immediately: heavy drinking, volatile relationships, public scandals that embarrassed the family she had sacrificed her happiness to protect. She married photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, a union that produced 2 children before deteriorating into mutual infidelity and acrimony. They divorced in 1978. Margaret became the first senior royal to divorce since Henry VIII. Her later relationship with Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior, became tabloid fodder. The princess who had given up Peter Townsend for propriety's sake was now photographed in swimsuits with a much younger man, looking lost and desperate, and nothing like the composed royal she was supposed to be. She chain-smoked herself into ill health, suffered a series of strokes, died on February 9, 2002, aged 71, having arguably never recovered from the Townsend affair. The Queen Mother outlived her by 7 weeks, just long enough to bury the daughter whose happiness she had declined to fight for half a century earlier. The prosecution calls its second witness. 3 decades after the Townsend affair, history repeated itself with almost mechanical precision. Same pattern, same lesson, same outcome. Different names. Prince Charles met Camilla Shand in 1972. He was 23. She was 24. Their connection was immediate, romantic, and by all accounts, genuine. Many who knew them believed they were ideally suited, 2 people who actually understood each other, who shared humor and interests, and something real. But Camilla was not virgin marriage material by royal establishment standards. She had a romantic history. She came from a family with associations that horrified the Queen Mother specifically. Camilla's great-grandmother was Alice Keppel, the notorious mistress of King Edward VII. Think about what that meant to the Queen Mother. She had spent her entire adult life defining herself against the abdication crisis, against a king who chose love over duty, against the American divorcee who stole her brother-in-law and thrust her unwilling husband onto the throne. She had buried that husband at 56, worn out by a job he never wanted, while Edward lived comfortably in exile until 77. Now here was her grandson, future king, entangled with the great-granddaughter of another royal mistress. History threatening to humiliate the family in the most pointed possible way. The Keppels, again, a century later, still seducing heirs to the throne. The Queen Mother reportedly found Camilla entirely unsuitable on multiple grounds, but the Keppel connection was the poisoned cherry on top. When Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, partly, biographers suggest, because she recognized Charles would never be permitted to choose her, the Queen Mother may have believed the problem solved. It wasn't. Charles never stopped loving Camilla. Their relationship continued, in various forms, even after her marriage. The Queen Mother, according to multiple royal biographers, consistently pressed Charles to find an appropriate bride and stop embarrassing the family with his attachment to a married woman. She explicitly invoked the parallels to Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. Continuing a relationship with someone else's wife would bring shame upon the monarchy, just as Edward's behavior had done. Find a suitable girl. Do your duty. Stop acting like your great-uncle. Enter Lady Diana Spencer. Diana emerged as the solution to everyone's problems, except her own. She came from the Spencer family, one of England's oldest aristocratic lines with intimate connections to the crown stretching back centuries. Her grandmother Ruth, Lady Fairmoy, was one of the Queen Mother's closest friends and ladies-in-waiting. The 2 old women had known each other for decades. They understood what the family needed. Diana was young, beautiful, appropriately virginal, from exactly the right sort of family. She checked every traditional box the Queen Mother cared about. She was also 19 years old when Charles proposed in February 1981, 13 years younger than the 32-year-old prince. No real-life experience, no independence, no ability to resist the institution that would consume her. The Queen Mother reportedly approved enthusiastically. Finally, a suitable bride. Someone who could be molded into a proper princess, a proper queen, a proper vessel for heirs. Someone who wasn't Camilla. The fairy tale wedding of July 29, 1981, was watched by 750 million people worldwide. The dress, the cathedral, the glass coach, the crowds lining the streets of London. We all know what came next. The marriage collapsed into mutual misery within years. Infidelity on both sides. Charles never stopped seeing Camilla, and Diana sought comfort elsewhere as her mental health deteriorated. Bulimia, depression, paranoia that the palace was working against her. She wasn't entirely wrong about that last one. The separation in 1992, the divorce on August 28, 1996, the most spectacular royal failure in modern history, playing out in tabloid headlines and tell-all interviews, and that devastating panorama broadcast where Diana said there were 3 people in her marriage. Diana died in a Paris tunnel on August 31, 1997. She was 36. Charles eventually married Camilla, the woman he'd loved since 1972, on April 9, 2005, 33 years after they first met, 3 years after the Queen Mother's death. One imagines the Queen Mother would have opposed that wedding had she lived to see it. Camilla was divorced. Love was triumphing over propriety. Everything she had fought against for 7 decades was happening anyway. Just slower. 2 romances, 2 generations, 2 women, Margaret by blood, Diana by marriage, whose happiness was deemed less important than the institution's reputation. The Queen Mother's lesson from 1936 hadn't changed. Only the victims had. The prosecution presents Exhibit C. This one's darker. In 1941, the same year the Queen was building her wartime legend, visiting bombed homes and holding hands with grieving mothers, her brother, John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, and his wife, Fenella, made a decision about their own daughters. Catherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon both had severe developmental disabilities. Neither had ever learned to speak. Catherine was 15, Nerissa was 22. That year, the family committed both girls to Royal Earlswood Hospital, an institution for the mentally disabled in Red Hill, Surrey. The institution would be their home for the rest of their lives. Institutionalization itself wasn't unusual for the era. Families routinely placed disabled relatives in residential facilities, believing professional care superior to what could be provided at home. The stigma around developmental disabilities was immense. Doctors encouraged institutionalization. Society expected it. This part, while tragic by modern standards, was standard practice in 1941. What happened next? Wasn't. The 1963 edition of Burke's Peerage, the definitive genealogical record of British aristocratic families, listed both Catherine and Nerissa as deceased. According to Burke's, Nerissa had died in 1940. Catherine had died in 1961. Both statements were false. Both women were alive. Someone had provided incorrect death dates to the official record. 2 living women, first cousins of the Queen, erased from official existence while still breathing, still eating, still sitting in institutional wards in Surrey. Nerissa actually died in 1986. Her grave was marked with a plastic tag and serial number. No member of the royal family attended her funeral. No proper headstone. Just a numbered tag in a mass grave section, as if she had never been anyone at all. The story broke in 1987 when journalists from The Sun discovered the truth. The headlines were brutal. Queen's cousins locked in mental home. The revelation that 2 women closely related to the monarch had been hidden away for decades and officially recorded as dead shocked the British public. Buckingham Palace initially declined to comment. The silence was deafening. A proper headstone for Nerissa wasn't erected until after the media exposure, more than a year after her actual death. Only public shame produced what basic decency should have provided automatically. Catherine lived until 2014, 73 years in institutional care, an entire lifetime hidden away. She outlived the Queen Mother by 12 years, still residing at the same facility where she'd been placed as a teenager during the Blitz. The Queen Mother's direct involvement in this deception remains unclear. Her brother made the initial decision about his own daughter's care, but her indirect involvement is documented. The royal household paid £125 annually for Catherine and Nerissa's care at Earlswood. Someone at the palace was writing those checks. Someone at the palace therefore knew both women were alive when Burke's peerage said they were dead. The Queen Mother served as patron for charitable organizations connected to Earlswood's parent institution. She had official ties to the very system that housed her hidden nieces. When the story broke, no member of the royal family spoke publicly about Catherine and Nerissa. No one explained the false death dates. No one apologized for the deception. The family simply weathered the scandal and waited for the news cycle to move on. The concealment served the family's collective image. Developmental disabilities carried enormous stigma in aristocratic circles. The fear that such conditions might be hereditary, that they might reflect poorly on the family line, that they might raise uncomfortable questions about genetic fitness. Whether the Queen Mother initiated the cover-up, approved it, or simply benefited from it without objection, the result was the same. 2 cousins, alive, listed as dead, hidden away while the family cultivated its spotless public reputation. The same woman who visited bomb sites in the East End, who held the hands of grieving mothers, who declared she could look them in the face because she shared their danger, that same woman's family had erased 2 disabled relatives from public records and left them to die in anonymous institutional care. Prosecution rests. Now, the defense. Because here's where it gets complicated. Everything the prosecution just presented is true, and so is everything the defense is about to say. September 1940. Nazi Germany began bombing London in earnest. The sustained aerial assault that became known as the Blitz would kill over 43,000 civilians and destroy more than 1 million homes before it ended. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth faced immediate pressure to evacuate. Canada was safe. The royal family could govern in exile if Britain fell, as the Dutch and Norwegian royals were already doing. Thousands of British children were being shipped across the Atlantic to escape the bombs. Princess Elizabeth was 14. Princess Margaret was 10. They could certainly go. Elizabeth refused. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." That statement wasn't mere political calculation. Or if it was calculation, it was brilliant calculation dressed as unshakable principle. The royal family would stay in London. They would share the danger that ordinary Britons faced every night when the sirens wailed and the bombs fell. On September 13, 1940, Buckingham Palace was bombed while the King and Queen were in residence. A German aircraft flew straight down the mall in broad daylight. 5 high-explosive bombs struck the palace. The royal chapel was destroyed completely. Windows shattered throughout the building. The King and Queen narrowly escaped injury. They'd been in a room directly above the courtyard where one bomb exploded. The Queen's response became the most famous quote of her life. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It means I can look the East End in the face." She understood something crucial about class dynamics in wartime Britain. East London's working-class neighborhoods were being devastated nightly by German raids. Factories, docks, densely packed housing, legitimate military targets that happened to be where poor people lived. Resentment toward the privileged classes in safer West End neighborhoods was building. Why should the rich escape while the poor burned? By having her own home bombed, by sharing the danger physically, not just rhetorically, The Queen claimed genuine solidarity. She wasn't merely expressing sympathy from a safe distance. She was standing in rubble, too. Her visits to bombed neighborhoods became legendary. She appeared in the wreckage wearing pastel colors and pearls, deliberately cheerful clothes, rather than mourning black, because she believed people wanted to see something bright amid the devastation. She spoke to survivors in the ruins of their homes, held hands with mothers who had lost children, picked her way through collapsed buildings with apparent disregard for her own safety. Unexploded ordnance and unstable structures be damned. Staff accounts from this period describe her as genuinely moved by what she witnessed. She cried privately after visits, they said, while maintaining perfect composure publicly. The performance of royal steadiness was real work, and she did it every day for 5 years. Adolf Hitler reportedly called her the most dangerous woman in Europe, because of her effectiveness at maintaining British morale. Historians have questioned whether this quote is authentic or apocryphal. No definitive source has been found. But authentic or not, it captured something true about her wartime role. She had become a symbol of British resilience, the smiling face of a nation that refused to surrender. The defense calls its second witness, the post-war decades. After the war ended and George VI died on February 6, 1952, the Queen Mother faced a choice. She could have retreated into widowhood, faded into the background, become a peripheral figure in her daughter's reign. Many expected exactly that. She was only 51, but royal widows traditionally withdrew from public life. She didn't withdraw. She reinvented herself. Over the following 5 decades, the Queen Mother became the monarchy's most effective soft power asset. She undertook official visits, attended hundreds of public engagements annually well into her 90s, and served as patron for more than 300 organizations. She opened hospitals, visited regiments, attended race meetings at Ascot, and generally made herself visible in ways that kept the monarchy connected to ordinary British life. Her social gifts were legendary among those who experienced them. She had an ability, reported by staff, officials, and casual acquaintances alike, to make everyone she met feel like the most important person in the room. She remembered names. She asked follow-up questions about details mentioned in previous conversations. She projected warmth so convincingly that even hardened political operators found themselves charmed. Winston Churchill remained personally fond of her for the rest of his life. Foreign dignitaries who visited Britain routinely reported that the Queen Mother was the highlight of their trip. American presidents, European royalty, Commonwealth leaders. She disarmed them all with the same combination of grace, humor, and apparent genuine interest. The gin and Dubonnet became part of the legend. Her daily routine included specific cocktails at specific times. And rather than hiding this from public view, she allowed it to become part of her charming image. The Queen Mother wasn't a stuffy Victorian relic. She was a woman who enjoyed her drinks, loved horse racing, told wicked jokes, and stayed up late at dinner parties. Relatable vices, endearingly human. She served as a bridge between the pre-war world and the modern era, giving the monarchy a sense of continuity that pure formality couldn't provide. When other institutions seemed to be crumbling, the church, parliament, the aristocracy, the monarchy retained affection, partly because it had her. The smiling grandmother, the woman in pastels, the link to the Blitz, to the war, to a time when Britain had been unified and heroic. People who met her, staff, soldiers, bombing survivors, foreign dignitaries, almost universally described her the same way. Charming, warm, funny, gracious. The kind of person who made everyone feel special while remaining utterly untouchable herself. She had social gifts that couldn't be taught, only possessed. She lived to be 101 years old, died on March 30th, 2002, at Royal Lodge in Windsor, with Queen Elizabeth II at her bedside. When her death was announced, The outpouring of grief was genuine and massive. Crowds gathered outside palace gates. Tributes flooded in from across the Commonwealth. More than 200,000 people filed past her coffin as she lay in state at Westminster Hall. A 4-day vigil that saw queues stretching for miles. For millions of people, especially those old enough to remember the war, she was quite simply the best of Britain. Defense rests. So, how do we reconcile these two people? The Blitz hero who held the nation together through its darkest hours, and the cold mother who watched her daughter's heartbreak and called it necessary, who pushed her grandson into a disastrous marriage, whose family erased disabled relatives from public records while she served as patron of their institutional charity. Here's my answer. We don't reconcile them, because they're both her. The Queen Mother wasn't secretly awful. She wasn't actually wonderful. She was both things simultaneously, depending entirely on whether you were inside her family or outside it. Public Elizabeth was warm, funny, charming, generous, accessible, beloved. She had social gifts that dazzled everyone who encountered them. She understood instinctively how to make people feel valued, how to project approachability while maintaining majesty. She genuinely cared about the broader British public in a real, tangible way that translated into genuine wartime heroism. Private Elizabeth was cold, controlling, and absolutely convinced that personal happiness must be sacrificed to institutional duty, because that's what she had done. When Edward VIII abdicated on December 11, 1936, he thrust an unwanted crown onto her husband, a nervous, stammering man who had never been trained for the role and never wanted it. She watched Bertie struggle through every speech, every public appearance, every crushing obligation. She watched him age decades in years. She watched him die at 56, worn out by a job that should have been his brother's. Meanwhile, Edward lived comfortably in exile with Wallace until 1972, 77 years old. Parties and dogs and holidays in the south of France, rewarded for his selfishness with a long, pleasant life. George VI chose duty, got an early grave. Edward VIII chose love, got 3 decades of leisure. What lesson would you take from that? Elizabeth took the worst possible one. Not that the system was cruel, not that perhaps the institution should bend for human happiness, but that those who chose love were traitors, and those who sacrificed love were heroes, and that this was simply how responsible people behaved. She applied this lesson to herself. She had reportedly turned down Bertie's proposals twice, reluctant to sacrifice private freedom for royal constraint. Then she accepted anyway, because duty. She applied it to Margaret. Peter Townsend made her daughter happy. So what? Duty came first. She applied it to Charles. Camilla made her grandson happy. So what? The institution came first. She built an entire moral framework around the principle that personal happiness was a luxury the crown could not afford. And she enforced that framework on everyone within reach. Here's the cruel irony. She might have been right about the institution. The monarchy survived because people like her sacrificed for it. The crown endured because duty was prioritized over desire, stability over passion, propriety over love. She understood something fundamental about how ancient institutions persist through centuries of change. They demand sacrifice, and they get it. But the people who made those sacrifices paid prices she never fully acknowledged. Margaret, drinking herself through lonely decades. Charles, trapped for 15 years in a loveless marriage. Diana, destroyed by the same machine that was supposed to elevate her. The hidden cousins, erased from records and left to die in institutional wards. The Queen Mother saw duty as its own reward. They saw it as a life sentence. So when people in the comments fight about whether the Queen Mother was awful or wonderful, they're not actually disagreeing about facts. They're disagreeing about which version of her they encountered. If you lived through the Blitz, she was your wartime hero. The woman in pastels picking through the rubble, holding your hand, telling you Britain would prevail. If you were her daughter, she was the woman who watched your heart break and told you it was necessary. If you were her grandson, she was the grandmother who pushed you toward a stranger instead of the woman you loved. If you were her disabled niece, you were simply erased, a plastic tag in a mass grave, a false death date in Burke's peerage. 73 years of institutional care while your famous relatives smiled for cameras and visited bombed neighborhoods and collected public adoration. Both things happened. Both were real. Both were her. The Crown understood something that comfortable royal coverage usually misses. People contain contradictions. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon was genuinely charming and genuinely cold. Genuinely warm to strangers and genuinely distant to family. Genuinely a hero of the Second World War and genuinely complicit in her family's concealment of disabled relatives. She was born August 4, 1900, at Glamis Castle in Scotland. The ninth of 10 children, raised in aristocratic comfort among Gothic towers and ghost stories, with no expectation of ever wearing a crown. She turned down Prince Albert's proposals twice before accepting on the third attempt. She married him on April 26, 1923, becoming the first commoner to wed a son of the reigning monarch in over 300 years. She became Queen Consort on December 11, 1936, the day her brother-in-law abdicated for love. She became Queen Mother on February 6, 1952, the day her husband died. She buried her younger daughter Margaret on February 9, 2002, then followed her 7 weeks later on March 30th. 101 years, an entire century of British history, from the Edwardian era through 2 world wars and into the age of Netflix dramas debating her legacy. Was she awful? The evidence says yes. Was she beloved? The evidence says that too. The Crown didn't invent a villain. It revealed a woman who was already 2 people, public and private, warm and cold, heroic and harmful, and trusted audiences to hold both truths simultaneously. Most royal coverage picks a side, sycophantic or scandalous, hagiography or hit piece. The Crown did something braver. It showed the private woman that contradicts the public memory and let viewers decide what to do with the contradiction. So was the show fair to her? Based on what you've now seen, the Blitz heroism and the hidden cousins, the crowds who adored her and the daughters who couldn't reach her, the wartime legend and the domestic ice queen, you tell me. Drop your verdict in the comments. The jury's been deliberating for 20 years now, and the case is still open. Subscribe for more stories like this.